Hi, welcome to episode 4 of Handicap Movers and Shakers, back after a week's break last week due to a fairly heavy workload. But pleasingly, since I last recorded, there have actually been a few runners from the first few episodes, and it's gone really well. Delivered 2 winners. Stormy Flight was a really impressive winner at Taunton, having pointed out that his first run back after a wind up, he looked to show improved form and was poised on a nice mark. He did it very nicely indeed. And then Kitty's Light, who was tipped up in episode 1, won really impressively in the Ida Chase. The only other one to run off the list so far was Mac and Lunatic, who did indeed go for the Devon National, as I suggested he might. Big step up in trip for him, and he ran a great race, finished second, just bumped into a resurgent Gwen Silly Burbass, who was a high class horse in his day, and just was a better horse on the day than the Mac and Lunatic, who did run well all the same. So 8 more this week, hopefully a few more winners in this list somewhere, and we'll get straight on with it. So as ever, start with the new entries. 2 this week that I think are on fairly nice opening marks. The first is School Days Over, trained by Fergal O'Brien, who comes in at a mark of 114. I thought he was a shade unlucky last time at Doncaster, finished second. But they had to bypass the final hurdle on that occasion at Doncaster, and Paddy Brennan had come down the stand side rail, had to make a very dramatic move around the flight that was bypassed, and just looked to me to get unbalanced in the saddle, and then never fully looked comfortable in his drive position. Finished second, beaten half a length by a good horse of Harry Derham's called Shed. But I think on a different day, the result might well have been different. But the handicappers put him in a mark of 114. He was giving £5 to Shed on that occasion, and Shed has got a mark of 122, which when you look at his balance of form doesn't look unreasonable. He'd run fairly well at Musselburgh before Doncaster and had won prior to that. So 122 doesn't look unfortunate for Shed, which leads you to believe that 114 is a very fair opening mark for School Days Over. To put it in context, if those 2 horses were to meet in a handicap now, Shed would meet School Days Over on £13 worse terms for just a half-length victory. So for me, I think there's certainly scope in this mark of 114, and that's backed up by his previous third-placed effort at Huntingdon. He was 4 lengths behind a very easy winner in Hansard, who's rated 129. But perhaps the better line to judge him off is that he was 10 lengths in front of Kensai Warrior, who's rated 111. So I think 114 is a fair opening mark for School Days Over, who showed some good bumper form. And I think 114 is a mark he can make a solid winning start to when he goes into handicaps. The second horse is #Boom, trained up north by Ruth Jefferson, and he comes in here now off a mark of 105. He's delivered 2 nice back-to-back runs in his second and third hurdle starts, having been fairly disappointing, I thought, in his first hurdle start. But he's an embryonic 3-mile chaser. He won a point-to-point on soft ground over 3 mile, and that form's worked out well. The second and third have both won point-to-points since, but he's stuck on well over 2 miles on the last 2 occasions. Most recently finishing third behind Blue Fin and Sea Elegant, who are well-regarded horses within their yards. Christian Williams actually mentioned Sea Elegant as the horse that he hopes will be a Saturday horse of the future. #Boom jumps a bit big, jumps a bit slow. He's not a 2-miler, but he's a big, weak horse. His second run over hurdles saw him finish second to Ruby Island, who I've actually mentioned on these previous. I think she's a really smart mare, and he stuck at it well on that occasion, but just isn't the class of Ruby Island. 2 mile 4, I think, is going to be more his gig for now. I think he's a 3-mile chaser eventually, but 2 mile 4 at the moment, off a mark of 105. Providing they don't aim too high, I think there's a little race to be won with him, but I think he's going to make a nicer chaser than he does hurdler, but 105 over hurdle shouldn't stop him getting a little win somewhere now this spring. Moving to non-movers now. And there's two here that I think are quite interesting, particularly this first one. And it's a mare of Dan Skelton's called Katira. Now, she's readily won 3 hurdle starts. She's won a bumper prior to that. But her latest win, I thought, was really impressive. It was at Market Raisin. Perhaps wasn't the deepest race, but she finished 19 lengths in front of She Likes the Lights, who's rated 101, but she was also giving her £10. And then back in third was Passionate Pursuits, and she beat her 26 lengths, again giving her £10. Now, Passionate Pursuits hasn't actually got a mark, but when you look at her form, she was previously a neck second to the 110 rated Ebonella, who's a decent mare in her own right. And then she also unseated at Wincanton when looking like giving Endless Escape a real race. I mean, I think she was definitely going better than Endless Escape at the time of departing 2 out at Wincanton. Now, you have to take into consideration Endless Escape is a thorough stayer and a real gritty battler. So I wouldn't be certain Passionate Pursuit was going to beat her, but she was going to give her a good race. And Endless Escape's rated 127. So I don't think she's a bad horse. She was 26 lengths behind, getting £10. Now, Katira has been left on a mark of 128, which I struggle to fathom, if I'm honest. It might all be academic because she does hold entries in the Ballymore Novices Hurdle at Cheltenham and the Mares Novices Hurdle at Cheltenham. So by the time she enters handicaps, her mark could well have risen further if she shows up well in those races, which I wouldn't put past her. I think the novice hurdles at Cheltenham this year are fairly open. I think she's a really impressive mare. She was pretty keen off the front end at Market Raisin over 2 mile 4, and if she got a bigger field at Cheltenham, she could well be one that could outrun her what will be likely double-digit odds. But it's a bit of a tenuous one because she just might not end up in handicaps off this mark. But 128, if the Skeltons were to skip Cheltenham for any reason and line her up in a handicap, I think 128 seriously underrates the ability of this mare. The next one is a John Joy O'Neill trained chaser at Iron Bridge, who ran at Warwick last week on what was fairly quick ground and just struggled to cope with the drop back and in trip over to 2 mile 4, having won over 3 mile 1 at Haydock previously. But he stuck to his guns really well, and his jumping was pretty solid. Ran on to finish second behind a sort of resurgent Galahad Quest, and got closer to the line they came. His mark has been unchanged on 137. I think he's still feasibly weighted off that mark. He's got some fairly fancy entries at the Cheltenham Festival in the Kim Muir and the Ultima, and indeed the National Hunt Chase. Whether he's quite up to that grade, I'm not so sure. But if they were to swerve that and lower their sights slightly, I think 137 probably isn't beyond this horse at the moment. He looks like he needs decent ground. He's been withdrawn a couple of times on soft ground. But 3 miles is definitely his trip. He just struggled over 2 mile 4 on a fairly quick track at Warwick. Then we go into 2 that have gone up in the handicap, but I still think are fairly well handicapped. And the first one is Broomfield Cave, Neil Mulholland trained horse, who showed really big improvement under Danny McMenamin, who gave him a nice ride, came down south for a couple of rides and rode him very well at Taunton last time. He was also up to 2 mile 3 on that occasion, and that seemed to suit him well. He's been pretty keen in his races up until that point, but he settled really nicely at the rear of the field for Danny McMenamin. Finished really well up the home straight at Taunton to run into third behind 2 horses who had a really nice passage through the race and were ridden prominently. Broomfield Cave did much the best of anything that was held up in that race. He's gone up £2 for that to a mark of 101. But Taunton clearly seems to suit him. That was his single best piece of hurdling form. Other than a 4th place finish in a novice hurdle at Taunton, beaten a fair distance, but it was his single best piece of novice hurdle form for sure. So Taunton's a track that clearly suits him. He's actually entered there tomorrow in the 140 over course and distance. Danny McMenamin again coming down from up north to ride. If they take the view that, given that he settled better last time, they can ride him a little bit more prominently, I think he's got an outstanding chance in this race. I've not looked fully through it. He's priced up at about 4 to 1. I don't think a £2 rise is going to stop him. I expect him to go close in that. And I think going forward, he'll stay a bit further than this 2 mile 3 trip. So 2 mile 4, 2 mile 5. I think he can continue to progress and stay ahead of his mark. And then the final riser is Balzer Stanford, who won at Warwick off a mark of 80. He's now up to 87, a fairly hefty rise. But I thought at Warwick he clearly showed a huge benefit for a wind up and the application of a first-time tongue tie. This was over 2 mile 4. Went from the front, jumped really nicely, very slick, very measured jumping. But turning into the home straight, the eventual second, Eros, looked to be travelling much the best. Alan Johns was sort of starting to shove away on Balzer Stanford. But 2 good jumps at the final 2 fences, and he stayed on very powerfully from the last to the line and actually ran out a fairly ready winner of 8 lengths. Eros is a perennial sort of runner-up. He's a solid horse, but he's not a sort of winning machine. But I thought Balzer Stanford did it very well, and I think he's undoubtedly going to stay further than this. I could see tracks with longer straights, stiffer finishes, and going up in trip, suiting him better. He's actually entered at Foss Lass on Sunday over 2 mile 5. I think sort of Foss Lass long home straight and an extra furlong can see him defy this mark of 87. He's very nicely bred. If he's got a bit of confidence now from being able to find his wind and get a win under his belt, I think he can progress further, and I don't think a mark of 87 is beyond him. And then finally, 2 that come down in the handicap, and actually starting with the same connections of Balzer Stanford at Bells of Peterborough, Tim Vaughan trained. He's a really consistent horse. He's been placed in 7 of his last 11 runs, including a couple of wins in there. But he's just not had his ground this winter, really. He's best on soft ground and very soft ground at that. And obviously the lack of rain has meant that opportunities to run on that sort of ground have been few and far between. But he's run very consistently. He ran a nice race at Chepstow at the weekend on ground that's quicker than ideal, travelled nicely, got outpaced before staying on well. Because he is so consistent, he gets very little respite from the handicapper. But he's actually come down £3 now to a mark of 123. That's just £3 higher than his last winning mark, which was an absolute demolition job at Chepstow on desperate ground. The rain's got to come at some point. If he does get a bit of soft ground, particularly around Chepstow, he's a smart animal. 123 certainly wouldn't have stopped him on his last winning effort on soft ground. And I expect him to go very close if given soft ground and 3 miles on a testing track. And then the last one ran on Saturday in the feature race at Kempton, the Coral Trophy Chase. And it's the Tom George trained Klondor Castle. Anyone that watches the SBK podcast will have seen that I was concerned that he would bounce after a big effort after 420 days off when he was previously second at Kempton on his reappearance run. And I think that sadly was the case. He never looked to travel. He didn't seem to have that zip and zest that you would associate with this horse. And he was eventually well beaten. He's down now though to a mark of 150, so he's been dropped £4. And I think that's a sizable drop for just one poor run that you can explain. He does hold an entry in the Ultimate Chase at the Cheltenham Festival. I've never really seen Cheltenham as his ideal track. I think he's best on flat galloping tracks. And as such, if they were to swerve Cheltenham and look towards Aintree, there's a nice Grade 3 handicap chase there over 3 miles. Aintree is a course he's run well at previously. He was second in the Betway Bowl 2 years ago, albeit beaten a long way, but that was behind Glanders Oboe. And he was also second in a Old Road Chase off a mark of 149 just 2 years ago. So his mark of 150 is a nice mark for him to be going into handicaps off. He is now 11. There is a chance that he's on the downgrade, but in the right race at the right price, I think a mark of 150 would warrant him taking serious consideration. And I'd be particularly interested if Tom George was to swerve Cheltenham and go to Aintree. So those are the 8 for this week. And As ever, please like, please subscribe. It's good to see the subscription numbers going up. Plenty of comments with you on Twitter and in YouTube comment section. So if you think this is going to be interesting for anyone you know, please send it their direction, and hopefully we'll build it as a little platform going forwards. I'll be back with From the Steward's Room tomorrow, and then hopefully back with an extra piece next week and a Handicap Movers and Shakers episode 5.